poverty is bad. Okay, I know what you're thinking. What does an 18-year-old guy with a background that has nothing else but a singular Mitski poster on it know about poverty? Well, it all begins with this is a book. I own several. Literature, though, may appear to be like the sporadic and recounting of words written by an erratic author, actually engenders thought and change within an individual, causing one to reflect upon the real world. Literature has the capability of laying out an individual's world in front of them in order to have them introspect onto the reasoning of their own world, almost as if they are a third-party observer. And for me, I feel that literature has played a huge part in letting me look upon my own world and learning from it. So undoubtedly, poverty is bad, but where does that statement lead us? Well, in George Orwell's book, Down and Out in Paris and London, Orwell recounts his time in London and Paris during the early 1900s when he lived in abject poverty. And in 1900s London, Orwell was homeless and he'd frequent something called a spike. Now, spikes were institutions set up by Victorian England in order for homeless people and poor people to sleep in, eat, and survive. Now, at first you might be thinking, wow, what a progressive idea, and what an invention that would allow the poor to thrive. Spikes. While at first they may seem like a progressive Victorian invention, spikes were systematically designed to keep homeless people out of sight of everyone else living in London. So spikes were each placed 10 miles apart from each other, and each individual would only be allowed to sleep in a spike for no more than 1 day. So that would mean that the homeless person would sleep in a spike, and then they'd wake up and they'd have to walk 10 miles to the next spike in order to find somewhere to sleep. So essentially, all that the homeless person would be doing during their whole life, like their whole day, would be walking from spike to spike. As such, homeless people in London would spend every day trekking from spike to spike and becoming drifters. Therefore, they wouldn't be sleeping on the streets. They'd be sleeping on spikes, but they wouldn't be loitering either, because all they'd be doing is moving from spike to spike in order to make it before the spike's closing time at sunset. So, as such, spikes created this illusion of homelessness. And while such an idea may seem foreign to us, like a systematic design that keeps homeless people out of sight, it's actually not far from the real world we live in.
1 week from today, the city of Phoenix will begin to clean up the homeless encampment.
Tonight, the city of Phoenix is restarting its cleanup of the zone.
Who run shelter. We've had a lot of success in getting people placed. Right now, the last number I just got was we placed 29 people into.
This block of 9th Avenue, the beginning of a court-mandated zone cleanup.
The homeless population in Phoenix has almost doubled in the past 10 years. And especially after COVID and the entirety of the pandemic, the Phoenix community has stepped in to aid the homeless population and fill in that gap of charity. Notably, ASU Project Humanities. Now, Project Humanities was founded in 2011 by Neil Lester in order to add humanity to the charitable aspect of aiding homeless people by donating products such as clothing and food while making conversation and interacting with the homeless person themselves, because they're still a person, they're still a normal person. And such actions by Neil Lester and his team are undoubtedly noble, and many of us, certainly I, can't even fathom the sacrifice they must endure every single day in order to give to the community. But if you've ever volunteered at Project Humanities, you certainly know this image. Now, when I volunteer at Project Humanities, I can help but wonder about the true social purpose of the donation center. And I was thinking about it, and whether we like it or not, Project Humanities donation center at 12th Avenue, Madison Street, notably Madison Street and Jackson Street, serves a social purpose besides being charitable. So, being on an quote unquote unfavorable part of town, the donation center on Madison Street somewhat attracts the entire homeless population to almost live there. So between Madison Street, 9th Avenue, and 15th Avenue, there's been a large encampment of homeless people living there, thus causing homeless people downtown to appear almost out of sight. And why is that? Is because almost the entirety of the homeless population within the Phoenix metro area migrated to 9th and 12th Avenue across Madison Street, resulting in kind of a drifting or an outcast of pushing away the homeless people into one singular part of the city. This way, many of the residents may not necessarily have to see the homelessness and they could just live comfortably in their air-conditioned apartments. But here's the thing. If that is the case, if Project Humanities does serve the social purpose, much like the spike of almost moving the homeless people out of sight, then what came first, the homeless encampment or Project Humanities Donation Center on Madison Street? Well, looking at Google Street View footage, we can actually find out that yes, pre-2011, before the founding of Project Humanities, Madison Street was almost empty. It was a regular business district. Yet, post-2011, Madison Street all of a sudden had become almost a refuge or a camp for all these homeless people seeking aid, rightfully so. And so where does literature tie into this? Well, the rising homeless problem in Phoenix almost parallels the homeless problem within Victorian England, because in Victorian England, in Orwell's England, the spikes were set up to keep homeless people out of sight, and Project Humanities and donation centers all over the country almost serve the same purpose, even if we don't want them to. So when a lot of lawmakers donate money and a lot of people push for these donation centers, sometimes they have the ulterior motive of moving the homeless people into one part of the city in order to make it an out of sight, out of mind problem. And literature dives into this because if I had never read Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell, I don't think I would have ever made the connection or made the realization that the donation centers such as ASU's Project Humanities serves this social purpose in particular. And in this, literature and reading itself has allowed for my thought process and thinking to occur within my mind while reflecting on the world in front of me almost as if I'm a third-party spectator. So when I was reading Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell, I was almost reading to a different world, and that caused me to reflect on my own world and where I live today, whether or not necessarily the conclusion is necessarily great or profound. It still engendered the thought and it broadened my perspective on our society, and it made me realize the dichotomy between charity and the literally unseen social problems and answers it grants us. Thus, literature has helped me engender so many endless thoughts by granting me the opportunity to reflect on our society as if I were a third-party observer, almost as if I were present in London and Paris at the time of Orwell's life, spectating all the joys and suffering life had to offer at the time.
Hey, I know this is kind of an awkward angle. It's not even in my bedroom, but I figured it'd just be easier to put my phone on this windowsill and just record. So, anyways, I've lived most of my life thinking that everything happens for a reason and like everything has a purpose. But the more that I like move on and live life, I know I'm only 18. Like there's so much more of life ahead of me and like so little behind me. But the more I keep going on, the less I feel like everything really has meaning or purpose. And like the more of my life's purpose is derived and caused by the cruelty of chaotic existence. But I mean, that's not necessarily a bad thing, so we'll get into it. A lot of this, what I just said, basically means that like a lot of life is really absurd and not necessarily everything has a reason on like why it's happening and why life is this way. So absurdism, like I was first introduced to the topic via Albert Camus' The Plague, which is the book I read for my literature circle unit. And in the book, there's basically two characters which are treated or not treated by Dr. Riot. So Dr. Riot is a doctor in this kind of medium-sized Algerian town called Oran. And at the time, Algeria was a French colony back in the 1940s. and during, before, and after the Second World War. And in the town, basically, a plague called the plague basilicus emerges. And the plague has like almost a 100% mortality rate. And like all the town's citizens are suddenly locked down in Oran, like this small, kind of, not small, but like medium-sized poor business town. And everyone there kind of lives for like business and just essentially making money. And this doctor there called Dr. Rio attempts to save as many people as possible. And now we have two cases I want to talk about within this book. The first is Father Penlieu. Penlieu is a priest in the town of Oran. And he gives two main sermons within the book. The first sermon is kind of him just saying that the plague has come to the citizens of Oran as a form of punishment for the way they've been living and the impious, like the not pious lives that they've led so far in their, like, during their whole existence. However, eventually the faith of the father is kind of shook after a young child dies to the plague. The child of one of the administrators of the town. The child dies, and in the book it's described as like no one has ever suffered more than this child has suffered during the plague, especially because the child was administered with an experimental serum which seemed to like almost like heighten all the negative effects of the plague, and the child's basically in suffering and he's like fighting for his death throughout like 3 nights, basically, like multiple days. And the priest sees this and he's just so shook by it, and he just doesn't understand how a god could let that happen. But then eventually he gives another sermon and he says that the plague is almost a necessary part of life because it is suffering endowed upon humans, given to humans, in order to learn and progress from it. It's necessary suffering. And Rio himself almost agrees with this, because when he's talking with his friend Taro, he's talking with his friend, and Rio says that everything he has learned in life has been from suffering. And the priest says this in a way of like trying to almost encourage the citizens to just accept the suffering of life and understand that it's necessary in order to live life. Like, part of life is suffering. And eventually the priest himself catches a form of the plague, or it's not entirely certain what he catches. The Dr. Rio can't exactly diagnose it properly, but the priest is described as passively submitting to the plague. So basically he just kind of gives up on his life and he doesn't do anything about it, and he just lets himself die. He lets himself die, and he doesn't attempt to fight the plague at all. And he just dies like in a whimper, basically. The other character I want to talk about is Taru. So Taru was one of Rio's like best friends in the novel. And Taru was kind of like a solemn, observant type, and he survives most of the book unafflicted by the plague. He's kind of like a young to middle-aged man. And he catches the plague right at the end. And he's lived the whole book attempting to, quote-unquote, be a saint. Or like be like the best version of himself. Or like be a great person. But the plague gets in the way of that. And he tells Rio, who's treating him, that he's not going to give up on this. And that he's going to keep resisting. And whether or not he dies from plague, he'll go down with a fight. So again, Taru, like the young child in the book, suffers greatly from the plague. He's described as like being lacerated and absolutely torn by it. Like almost every inch of his body, like covered in boils, and he's just suffering constantly for day after day for like around 3 nights until his passing comes. And he kind of dies in like almost in shambles. Like his whole body is like discombobulated. like as he spent so much energy trying to fight the plague. And basically, what that dichotomy between the priest's death and Taru's death is that no matter whether either of them resisted or not, they were met with the same fate, like irrespective of what had happened and like what the story was. And in that, it kind of shows the absurdism of the universe and how no matter kind of what choices you choose, sometimes that your choices, like the ending, occurs irrespective of the choice you make in the life that you lead. So to go back to what I was saying earlier, irrespective of the choices made by either Penlo or Taru himself, they both were met with that same fate at the end of the novel, which is death via the plague. And it kind of just shows that irrespective of one's choices, an ending occurs, almost not related to the choices made to begin with. And this kind of all leads back to the myth of Sisyphus, which Camus liked a lot. And in the myth of Sisyphus, Sisyphus wrongs the gods multiple times. He cheats them. And they doom him by making the rest of his life, essentially, for the rest of his life, he has to roll a boulder up a hill. And as he's rolling the boulder, and he rolls the boulder, and he's about to reach the top of the hill, the boulder falls back down, and he has to start all over again. And in that, it just kind of shows no matter whether or not, or how hard, or how fast, or how slowly Sisyphus pushes the boulder up the hill, it's going to roll back down, and he has to start all over again to begin with. And it just kind of shows the absurdity of the universe and how one's choices aren't necessarily like immensely impactful upon the outcome. And now you might be saying, okay, where does that lead us? That seems like kind of very somber and kind of sad. But in a way, that absurdity almost like reassures a person, almost reassures you that yes, life is absurd, but you can learn from it, and you can make choices and reflections, like introspect constantly and become a different person who's capable of living in this universe. So despite of all the pain and suffering that you face, you are capable of building from that and turning yourself into a different person, because at the end of the day, you'll never be able to change the outcome, but you can change your outlook on it. And I would have never thought a lot about this or realized this if I hadn't read The Plague. And it just made me realize how even through reading like a fictional setting of a stupid town in the 1940s that like had no significance upon history or the world itself, whether it's fictional or not, still can impact my life greatly. And that's how like the beauty of literature, and how we can take literature which itself could have no meaning, like something, a piece of literature can just exist, but we are capable of deriving meaning and getting sense out of it and making it part of ourselves and learning more from it. And in that way, literature has impacted my life greatly and immensely and has shaped me into a different person today.
I just wanted to end off the video on another note, which is Candide, and mainly the line "cultivate our garden." Let's cultivate our garden, and that line I feel resonates or makes me think so much, because so many problems we look unto. Okay, so we look into the problems of our lives, and we often think that there's an external factor and there's an external force that we must fight, an external force we must fight. And there's always a villain out there trying to bring us down, like something holding us back. But in reality, most of the time, it's ourselves. And what I take the phrase cultivate our garden to mean is that if you just work on yourself and you pay attention to your needs and how you can go about life and accomplish your purpose, whatever it may be, hopefully a good one, whatever it may be, to impact yourself mainly. And as a result of that, once you cultivate your own garden, you will attract the butterflies, and think about it, like the butterflies come to your garden and they spread around to all the other gardens around you. So whenever you work on your own garden, it creates a more fertile, more able soil for everyone else around you. So if people, instead of targeting such large, like almost societal problems in hopes of eliminating their own suffering and maybe possibly their own pain, cultivating one's own garden, I feel, is the most important aspect of one's life, because that's all a person can do. The world itself, the universe even, is too large for any of us to fathom or do anything to impact it. And the best thing that we can do is just cultivate our garden, focus on ourselves, focus on our thoughts, introspect, try to improve, try to be a kind person. And though Candide was like somewhat questionable novel with like its style and its absurdness and its randomness, that style allowed you to kind of be placed into another world where, irrespective of all the silliness that occurs, you could relate to your own world within the silliness of Candide's world. And Voltaire does that by kind of emphasizing all the like haha funny bad stuff's going on, and yet we're okay with it with our society, kind of like all the wars and the destruction that he describes that just occurs day by day, even while I'm recording this video, and it's just unbeknownst to me. Yet all I could do is cultivate my garden. There's nothing. One must realize that there's not much they could do to stop much of the processes of the world around them. So what you should focus on is cultivating your garden. I know I said a lot, but it's such a resonating line, and it's quite a simple line. And through the absurdness of the world Candide's presented with, all he can do is cultivate his garden and work on himself and generally try to improve the world by improving himself. And I don't think I would have ever come to as clear and as clairvoyant of a realization as if I hadn't read Candide. And the way literature ties into this is because the way it's portrayed and the way Candide is written kind of turns it from like a boring life lesson that one looks at it to almost an entertaining novel like one can learn from. And that combination of entertainment and like slowly seeding in life lessons is kind of like when you're young and then your mom or your parent and or legal guardian grabs a blender and puts in like an egg and spinach like in a smoothie in order for you to eat something healthier, like just load it up with greens, kind of like to trick you. And like it's not that Voltaire's trying to trick us, but it's that he sprinkles in all these little lessons within his novel, and that's something literature itself is excellent at, which is spoon feeding you lessons of moral like life reflections in the form of entertainment. I think AP Lit genuinely has been one of the most impactful classes of my life. My writing and the way I think has changed so much because of this class, and I'm certainly glad I took it. And I'm glad of the person I have become as a result of it. And so I just want to thank you, Mr. Bilek, for granting me the opportunity to be in your class, and for you for being such a wonderful teacher. And honestly, picking a bomb ass literature like selection of literature for an entire year. All the books we read were like some of the best books I've ever read in my life, especially Beloved, I think, is genuinely one of the best, one of the most well written pieces of literature I've ever read in my life. Which I know sounds stupid because, like, I mean, it's not like 18th century or like old Shakespearean literature, but the way it's written, it's so vivid, and I would have never thought I could enjoy a novel with like kind of like a quote unquote ghost story. I hate science fiction, but the fact that Toni Morrison plays with the idea of post-bellum America, like post-Civil War, and a ghost story and racism and all the suffering and pain and love that the characters go through just kind of genuinely blows my mind. And I don't think I could have ever come up with something like that in a million years, whether I write it or whether it's just a random thought in my head. And it's just been a very humbling and learning full experience being in your class. So thank you.